welcome to All Hands on Tech, where today's leaders talk tomorrow's technology. I'm Jeremy Morgan. In this podcast, we're going to take a trip back in time, 25 years to be exact, and look at the history of the programming language that changed tech forever, Java. Let's go back to December 1990. Now, earlier that year, wrecking balls smashed into the Berlin Wall, and it was one of the most prolific symbols of the end of the Cold War. The world was changing. Our culture was changing. The Hubble telescope sent back its first images from space. Personal computers were beginning their invasion into our homes, though they weren't exactly mainstream yet. But the writing was on the wall. The personal computer revolution was in full swing. Microsoft had just released Windows 3.0 and became the first company to make more than $1 billion in sales. A British computer scientist named Tim Berners-Lee had just finished up a rough proof of concept for a system of sharing documents all over the world. He called it the World Wide Web. Now, the world was on the verge of something big. It was during this time that the language we know as Java was hatched. Let's talk about Java and how it began. Now, in December of 1990, a team was formed for creating next-generation smart appliances, such as set-top boxes for televisions. The lead of the group had threatened to leave the company earlier that year. He'd only stayed on the condition that the team could operate autonomously, separate from the bureaucracy and policies of the company at the time. The team was called the Stealth Group, and they operated out of a small office in Menlo Park, California. One of the members and eventual leaders of the team was James Gosling, a developer who was already quite accomplished at the time. A PhD from Carnegie Mellon University, he'd invented an early Unix windowing system called News, Gosling Emacs, and built a multiprocessor version of Unix. He was a brilliant programmer and already a heavy contributor at Sun. Now, originally they began developing the project with C and C++. Because these were small set-top appliances, they had to be frugal with memory and CPU cycles. One of the biggest problems with C++ was that it required too much memory. Another problem was the fact that C and C++ compile binaries for a specific processor, so many different versions of the software would have to be written. Now, James Gosling had an idea and a vision that would solve their problems. It would use a model that's still part of the essence of Java today. Now, while in grad school, he'd created a virtual machine on Carnegie's VAX computer so it could run Pascal programs that were built for another computer system. And it was more than a mere translator, it was emulating a machine within the VAX system. His vision was an expansion on this. Rather than the C++ model of writing code and compiling the instructions for a specific CPU, he would create a virtual machine that runs on several CPUs, and the language the software was written in would compile instructions for the virtual machine instead of the CPU architecture. It was ambitious, especially for the time, but they started working on it. The stealth team became the Green Team, and they began building a language that they named Oak, after the oak tree that sat outside James's office window. By the summer of 1992, they had a working model of Oak. It ran on the Green OS, and for a demo, they had built applications for a PDA device named Star 7. It had a graphical interface and a smart agent named Duke. Oak was more than a proof of concept at this point. Later that year, the Green project was spun off into a subsidiary company of Sun named First Person. The team was expanded and relocated to Palo Alto. Now, the goal of First Person was to create software for interactive set-top devices. Now, this is what they set out to do originally, but they focused their efforts on winning a bid for a platform that Time Warner had designed. They ended up losing the bid to SGI, and it's rumored that the cable industry folks thought their platform gave too much control to the user. After another set-top box proposal fell through, the company wasn't able to get any footing in the television industry, so the group was rolled back into Sun. Then the internet happened. In the summer of 1994, Gosling and his team had a brainstorming session with John Gage, the director of science for Sun, and Eric Schmidt, who we know later would become the CEO of Google. They held a multi-day session to figure out what they could do with Oak. They had what was shaping up to be an amazing product, but the set-top box idea wasn't panning out. So they decided to retarget their platform for the World Wide Web. Now, 1994 was a turning point for the web. That small project for sharing documents that Tim Berners-Lee was working on at CERN, it was being used all over the world now. Some of the key principles behind sharing and openness that Berners-Lee had championed early on helped propel the idea to the mainstream in just a few short years. Now, the brainstorm group decided that graphical web browsers like Mosaic would help turn the internet into the interactive medium that they were striving for with TV. They wrote a small web browser named WebRunner, named after the movie Blade Runner. But they had a small problem. It was around this time that the team found out that a company down the street, Oak Technology, was already using the name Oak. Now, if you were in computing in the 90s, you might remember Oak made sound cards and CD-ROM drives. Oak CD-ROM.sys was the CD-ROM driver of choice for early DOS and Windows systems. So Sun's lawyers said they can't use the name Oak. In January of 1995, the team had a brainstorming session. And they came back with Java, DNA, and Silk. Now, Kim Polizzi was the Oak product manager, and she says, "I spent a lot of time and energy naming Java because I wanted to get precisely the right name. I wanted something that reflected the essence of the technology, dynamic, revolutionary, lively, fun. Because this programming language was so unique, I was determined to avoid nerdy names. I also didn't want anything with net or web in it because I found those names to be very forgettable. I wanted something that was cool, unique, easy to spell, and fun to say." And so Java was born. They had a new name, a clear mission, and a product nearly ready for release. On May 23, 1995 at the Sun World Conference, John Gage announced the first public beta release of the Java Development Kit, or JDK. The original release came with the Java Runtime, which was a virtual machine and a set of class libraries. It also contained development tools like the Java compiler, so you could write Java and build applications with it. It ran on Windows, Mac OS, Linux, and Solaris. Now, at that same Sun World Conference, Mark Andreessen, Executive VP of Netscape Communications, unexpectedly announced that Netscape browsers would include Java support. Java had arrived. In January, Sun Microsystems formed the JavaSoft Group to further develop Java technology. Now, saying that Java made a huge splash is an understatement. It was the hottest thing in tech. James Gosling's vision of writing applications without worrying about hardware abstractions had become a reality. It became extremely popular overnight. Now, why was Java so popular? Well, it made the promise of write once, run anywhere. You could develop Java applications and using that same code, deploy it to Windows, Mac, or Linux. And it was free. Now, the code was similar to C++, so it was intuitive for programmers to pick up. The principles for building Java programs added to the allure. The principles are simple, robust, portable, platform-independent, secure, high-performance, multi-threaded, architecture-neutral, object-oriented, interpreted, dynamic, and distributed. Some of the goals of the project were: it could be simple and take good features from earlier languages. Have a simple set of APIs with basic and advanced features. Get rid of things like direct manipulation of hardware and memory management. And it could be platform and architecture independent. Be able to manipulate network programming, and be embeddable in web browsers through applets. This seems like a tall order for a single language, but they pulled it off. The pain points expressed years ago were solved with this new language. Programmers swarmed to this new product. Magazines and tech journalists started talking about it constantly, and as websites began popping up all over the internet, Java was being put into use. Now, initially, the JDK, or Java Developer Kit, was the only way to have Java on your machine. Sun soon released the Java Runtime Environment, which was software that you could install on your computer to run Java programs that programmers had written. And the rest of the 90s had become a time of rapid expansion for Java. In 1998, Java 2 was released, which contained the JDK 1.2, and it was a fairly big revision. They rewrote much of the event handling and made changes to thread synchronizations. They also introduced the JIT, or just-in-time compiler. Now, the cool thing about a just-in-time compiler is it takes certain chunks of code and only compiles it when it's needed. Once it's compiled, it caches that static binary. It was a use-it-if-you-need-it model that greatly increased performance in applications. Throughout the remainder of the 90s, hobbyists and enterprise alike adopted Java worldwide. Enterprise tools emerged and Java exploded with the growth of the internet at the time. As the 2000s emerged, Java was firmly established in business software. New features in Java centered around the programmer and their needs. The Hotspot JVM, or Java Virtual Machine, was released, which was a high-performance environment for desktops and servers. It had more just-in-time compilation and adaptive optimization. Now, Hotspot was interesting because it was very innovative for its time. Sun originally started development on the Self Virtual Machine, which was an interpreter that would replace the first compiler. That project was canceled, and 2 engineers left Sun to start a company to build a similar product. And a couple years later, Sun purchased that company to use the compiler, and that became Hotspot. The term hotspot comes from how it works. It would analyze the Java bytecode and look for hotspots that are executed frequently. It would then target these hotspots and optimize them. This led to increased performance with lower overhead. And it became the default JVM for Java in version 1.3. In 2006, Sun open-sourced it with the JDK under the new general public license. Throughout the 2000s, Java ruled the enterprise. Major enhancements were developed for testing, logging, and debugging. Other features included SSL support, XML processing, regular expressions, and much more. The JVM underwent tons of improvements, including mapping into memory as a single image instead of multiple class files. Web service applications became very popular, and Java was front and center with XML web service applications. APIs for desktops were developed and refined, as well as additional monitoring and management tools. As databases became more popular, Sun put a ton of work into developing great APIs for databases. But as the 2000s went on, Java was no longer the hottest thing in tech. Folks had moved on, as they do, and focused on web development technologies that emerged, like PHP and JavaScript libraries. It was no longer the hot new item like it was a decade earlier, but it was by no means dead. Java was slipping away into the shadows of tech for the most part. It had already gained somewhat of a reputation for being a boring enterprise tool. Naturally, throughout the 2000s, there were groups of people saying Java is dead and this will be the year Java goes away, but of course, none of that happened. Java just kept progressing along and infiltrating millions of devices and computers all over the world. Everything from large-scale server applications to toasters had some Java in them somewhere. And it seemed for a while that Java would quietly slip away in the shadows and just keep the enterprises running. But then the next big thing happened. In the late 2000s, smartphones invaded the world. While cell phones themselves were ramping up in use throughout the early part of the century, for years behind the scenes, companies were developing something bigger. All the way back in 2003, a small company in Palo Alto named Android Inc. was working on some special software. It was to, quote, make smarter mobile devices that are more aware of its owner location and preferences. Microsoft was working on Windows Mobile and actually got some products out there before the big ones that we know today. And as you know, Apple was working on developing smarter phones as well. For a few years there were many top-secret projects going on developing smarter, better phones. Andy Rubin, one of the founders of Android Inc., was struggling to find investors, and it got to the point where the company was going to get evicted from their office space. Steve Perlman, a friend of Rubin's, brought him $10,000 in cash in an envelope to keep him afloat. And Steve is quoted as saying, "I didn't want a stake in the company, I just did it because I believed in the thing and I wanted to help Andy." Well, in July of 2005, Google acquired Android Inc. for $50 million. Their mission was to build a smartphone to rival BlackBerry, which was the dominant maker at the time. June 29, 2007, Apple released the iPhone. It sent shockwaves throughout the tech community and society at large. It was a phone that would take photos, play music, browse the web, send text messages, and more. There was a new feature called Apps, where developers could develop applications and sell them to iPhone users. The applications had to be written in Objective-C, which was a language developed specifically for the iOS platform. Now, Google had been working on a similar project, but they were lagging behind. And a year later, on September 23, 2008, Google released the HTC Dream Android phone. You could also run apps on this phone, and Google was quick to set up tools for developers to build applications. What language would they be written in? Java. The difference in the approach may be one reason that Google's phone took so long to release. Apple manufactured one phone, and the hardware and software were all under the control of Apple. This is still true today. Developers had to register with Apple and develop their applications using Apple tools and Apple computers and publish them through the Apple App Store. Android, on the other hand, is completely opposite. Android runs on tons of platforms and devices. In fact, Google created a consortium of companies called the Open Handset Alliance. They wanted to create an open, shared platform for mobile phones. While you needed special tools and an Apple computer to develop iPhone apps, Android was a free-for-all. Any computer that could run Eclipse and a Java compiler was fair game. This coordination was not easy, and it means you have one piece of software that must run on hundreds of different devices. Does this sound familiar? It's no wonder they picked Java as the language of choice to develop these applications. It was born for this. Now suddenly, overnight, Java is hot again. Developers scrambled to build applications for smartphones and tablets running Android. They could build games, productivity apps, music, whatever. For some, it was an easier transition to mobile development if they already knew Java. The ecosystem exploded. So by this time, Java was entrenched in enterprise software. It's installed on over 850 million PCs. You can find Java applications on desktops, on servers, small memory devices, appliances, the list goes on. And then mobile devices exploded, and many of them were running Java. Then another big change came along. On January 27, 2010, Sun Microsystems was acquired by Oracle for $5.6 billion. It was a bold move. Sun and Oracle were competitors for years. Although Java originated with Sun, and it was a large part of their ecosystem, Sun Microsystems was a hardware company, which raised some concerns about antitrust regulations. Oracle was now a software and hardware company. Now this caused a big shakeup. Sun CEO Jonathan Schwartz resigned. The DBMS team collectively resigned and moved to Rackspace. The JRuby team also collectively resigned and moved to Engine Yard. And in April 2010, James Gosling, the creator of Java, resigned from the company. He cited many reasons, including reductions in pay, status, and decision-making ability. It was a new era. While the choice to use Java on the Android platform certainly brought Java back into the limelight again, it wasn't all peaches and roses. Oracle filed a patent infringement lawsuit against Google over its use of Java on the Android platform. By design, Android apps run in the Dalvik Java virtual machine. The apps are written in Java, but they compile to a different format to run in the Dalvik machine. This means these apps cannot be run in the Java runtime. This allowed Google to avoid licensing fees from J2ME, which was the mobile version of Java. In the first trial, Google was found liable for some code copying, but the court ruled that they did not infringe on Oracle patents. There was a lot of back and forth, and in 2016, a jury found that Google had violated copyright laws when they used Java on the Android platform. Today, Java is extremely popular. It's enjoyed a big resurgence thanks to the new ways that it's being used. Now, while it's firmly seated in areas like servers, desktops, mobile applications, and micro devices, it's now being used in scientific applications, including natural language processing. It's being used for big data to handle high-performance data processing. And Java is finding a home in AI and ML applications as well. The Spring framework for Java is an application framework that's taken off in the last few years. Modern applications like web APIs and microservices are a breeze with Spring. The Spring community is growing faster every day and full of smart, helpful engineers building really cool things. It's estimated there are 9 million Java developers out there. And Java has come a long way since being developed by 13 engineers on Sand Hill Road in Menlo Park. Java was created to bring interactivity to TV set-top boxes that never materialized. But because it was designed to eliminate these pain points for developers and it came together so well, they decided to pivot and use it elsewhere. And it changed the world. So thank you for coming along with me on this journey. All Hands on Tech is a podcast where today's leaders talk about tomorrow's technology. You can find transcripts, info, and more at pluralsight.com/podcast.